So this whole thing started because I was too broke to buy a proper desk lamp. I am a second-year university student. My name is Kai. I live in a single-room apartment that costs me exactly 70% of my monthly budget and smells permanently of instant noodles. My desk has a wobble. My chair has one armrest. My window faces a brick wall. I am telling you this so you understand the financial situation I was in when I walked into the garage sale on Clement Street on a Saturday morning looking for a cheap lamp and walked out 40 minutes later carrying a fish tank. It was not a small fish tank. It was a massive glass cube, about 60 centimeters on each side, with an ornate dark wood frame that looked genuinely old, the kind of old that has a history rather than just an age. The glass was thick and clear. The base was solid. There was a fitted glass lid with small ventilation holes drilled along the edges. Inside the tank was the most elaborate decorative medieval village setup I had ever seen. Tiny stone buildings. A mill next to a tiny stream. A market square with little stalls. A wall around the whole village made of what looked like actual stone carved to scale. Rolling hills outside the walls with miniature trees. Paths leading between buildings. A well in the center of the square. And outside the village walls, I had to look twice to be sure, a tiny encampment. Rows of what appeared to be tents. Tiny flags. Tiny figures that looked like they were arranged in combat formation. The detail was extraordinary. I had never seen model work like it. Every building had individual stone textures. The trees had individual leaves. The well had a tiny bucket hanging from a tiny rope. I asked the old woman running the sale how much. $5. I paid the woman before she could change her mind. I carried it home on the bus with it on my lap, getting looks from everyone who saw it, and set it on my desk next to my wobbly lamp. I leaned in close to examine it, and a tiny person ran out from behind the well, looked directly up at me, and screamed. I want to be very clear about what happened in the next 30 seconds. The tiny person, maybe 2 centimeters tall, wearing a rough linen shirt and patched trousers, ran out from behind the well, looked straight up at my face pressed against the glass, and screamed something in a language I did not understand. Then 17 other tiny people ran out of the buildings around the square. They all looked up at me. They all screamed. They all ran back inside and slammed their tiny doors. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the tank. I looked at my hands. I looked at the tank again. I picked up my phone and typed into the search bar, "Can model figurines move on their own?" The search results were not helpful. I leaned close to the tank again and looked at the building the first person had run into. Through the tiny window, I could see a tiny face pressed against the inside of the glass looking back at me. Our eyes met. The tiny face disappeared immediately. I said out loud to my empty apartment, "Okay." I ordered delivery. I ate my food. I watched the tank for 2 hours without anything moving. Then at about 11 p.m., when my room was dark except for my desk lamp, the tiny door of the building opened again, and the original person came out very slowly, looked up at me, and tried to speak. I could not hear it. The glass was too thick and they were too small. I reached out and very carefully slid the glass lid open a few centimeters. The tiny person was standing in the middle of the square looking up at me with the particular expression of someone who has decided to do something terrifying and is not going to stop now that they have started. They asked, in accented but completely understandable English, if I was a god. I said no. I was a university student. There was a very long pause while they processed this. They asked what a university was. "A school," I said. "For adults." "Were you a demon then?" "Pretty certain I was not," I told them. They looked at me for a long time. Then they went back inside. I sat at my desk at 11:15 p.m. on a Saturday night, staring at a fish tank containing living people, and thought about my life choices. The next morning I woke up and immediately checked the tank. Everyone was out. All 18 of them, I had counted, were standing in the square looking up at my ceiling. When I leaned over the tank they all froze, then very slowly turned to look at me, with the careful, controlled energy of people who had spent the night deciding how to handle this situation and were now executing their plan. The original person, the first one who had talked to me, stepped forward. I had started thinking of this person as the spokesperson. They were clearly the bravest one, or the most expendable one. I was not sure which. The next morning I woke up and immediately checked the tank. Everyone was out. All 18 of them, I had counted, were standing in the square looking up at my ceiling. When I leaned over the tank they all froze, then very slowly turned to look at me with the careful, controlled energy of people who had spent the night deciding how to handle this situation and were now executing their plan. The first one who had spoken to me stepped forward. I had started thinking of them as the spokesperson. Clearly the bravest one, or the most expendable. I was not sure which. After a night of village discussion, they had reached a verdict. Not a demon, not a spirit, something from the land above the sky, which was their way of making sense of a third-floor apartment on Clement Street. I told them I was a person, just a much larger one. They nodded seriously, as if this confirmed a theory. Then they said what changed everything. Our village is dying. And those 4 words changed the tone of everything that followed. Her name was Lyra. That was her actual name, not something I decided to call her. She told me herself on the second day, after we had established enough trust for introductions. She was 20 years old, the daughter of the village miller. The mill I had admired in the village setup was her family's mill. She had been the first one to approach me not because she was the bravest, but because her father had told her that if there was any chance of survival, she had to take it regardless of how terrifying the source was. Through careful conversation conducted by sliding the lid open slightly and speaking slowly and clearly, I began to understand the situation. The village was called Millhaven. It had 46 people. It sat in a valley that had been suffering from severe drought for 2 years. Their crops had failed. Their well was running low. Their food stores were nearly gone. And outside the village walls, the encampment I had seen was an army. Not a large army by any standard I would recognize. 60 soldiers working for a lord who owned the land. They were there to collect taxes. When the village could not pay because there was nothing to pay with, the soldiers had simply stayed, surrounding the village, cutting off the road, waiting for the villagers to surrender whatever they had left. That had been 17 days ago. The village had enough food for perhaps 4 more days. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the tank. 60 soldiers. 46 villagers. 4 days of food left. I looked at my desk. On my desk, a half-eaten bag of fish food I had bought on the way home yesterday. I had briefly considered actually using the tank for fish before the current situation made that impossible. A bottle of water. My laptop. A pen. My phone charger cable coiled next to the power socket. A vitamin C tablet I had been meaning to take for 3 days. An empty mug. A small hand warmer packet left over from winter. I looked at the fish food. It was a standard bag of tropical fish flakes. The flakes were small, pale gold, and smelled faintly of the sea. I picked up the bag and looked at the feeding instructions. Sprinkle a small pinch onto the water surface twice daily. I looked at the village. At Lyra standing in the square looking up at me. I told Lyra to step back. Get everyone away from the center of the square. She turned and shouted to the others. The square cleared in about 10 seconds. I opened the tank lid fully, reached in with 2 fingers, and pinched the smallest amount of fish food I could manage. Barely anything, just a few flakes stuck to my fingertip. I held it over the village center. Let go. From my perspective, a few small flakes drifted down and settled on the ground of the square. From Lyra's perspective, she told me this later, it looked like enormous golden tiles the size of tables descending slowly from the sky, landing without impact, covering the square in a layer of warm-smelling golden material that nobody in the village had ever seen before. She picked one up with both hands. It was bigger than she was. She bit the corner. She immediately sat down on the ground. Then she stood up and sprinted toward the other buildings, screaming at the top of her tiny lungs. Within 2 minutes, every person in Millhaven was in the square. The fish food flakes covered everything, each one the size of a dining table to them. The smell was extraordinary, rich, complex, nothing like anything they had ever experienced. People were breaking pieces off and eating with the focused urgency of people who had not had a full meal in weeks. An old man sat down in the middle of the square, broke off a piece the size of his fist, took one bite, and started crying. I sat at my desk and watched this happen. Then I pinched another small amount of fish food and released it. More golden tiles raining down. The square was full of food. More than the village had seen in months. More than enough for everyone. One of the older women, white-haired, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been conserving energy for a very long time, walked into the center of the square, looked straight up at me, and pressed both hands to her chest. She did not have the English that Lyra had. She did not need it. The expression on her face needed no translation whatsoever. I reached for the fish food bag again. The army outside the walls was a problem I had been looking at for a while. 60 soldiers. Armed. Working for someone called Lord Aldrich, who I gathered from Lyra's descriptions, was the medieval equivalent of a landlord who had decided that waiting was cheaper than attacking and was simply starving the village into compliance. I had been watching them through the glass. They were camped on the open ground outside the village wall, in the part of the tank that had been set up as a sort of landscape feature, with tiny sculpted hills and miniature trees. The camp was organized in neat rows. They had a fire burning. They had their own food supplies, which they were not sharing with anyone. Their leader, a man I could identify by his slightly more elaborate clothing and the fact that everyone else turned to face him when he moved, was sitting in a folding chair outside a tent that was noticeably larger than the others, eating something. He had been sitting in that chair for 17 days. He was by any measure winning. I looked at my desk. My phone charger cable was coiled next to the power socket. It was a standard USB cable, white, about 1 meter long, maybe 5 millimeters in diameter. To me, a phone charger cable. To the 60 soldiers camped outside Millhaven. A rope thicker than any they had ever seen, stronger than any material they had access to, as long as a city block. I picked it up. I held it over the tank. I looked at the army camp. I looked at where they had their horses tethered. 8 horses, tied to a horizontal wooden rail outside the camp on the northern side. I lowered the cable very slowly over the northern side of the tank. The soldiers closest to it saw it coming. They started shouting. The cable settled onto the ground about 10 feet from the horse enclosure, which from their perspective was about 30 meters, a large open space between the cable and the horses. The soldiers stared at it. It was white, perfectly cylindrical, impossibly thick, and had appeared from nowhere, descending slowly from above without any sound. I left it there. Then I reached into the tank and very slowly, very carefully, moved the end of the cable, so it lay across the entrance of the army camp, blocking the main path in and out. The soldiers could step over it. It was not blocking them physically, but the effect was immediate. They stopped moving. They clustered on one side of the cable staring at it. Several of them took several steps back. The leader stood up from his chair for the first time in what looked like hours. I picked up a pen from my desk. I tapped the cable once with the pen tip. From their perspective, a finger the size of a building reaching down from the sky and tapping an impossibly large white rope with a sound that echoed through the camp. The leader sat back down, then stood up again, then sat back down. Then one of his soldiers said something and pointed at the village wall. I followed the gesture and saw Lyra standing on top of the village wall looking down at the army with an expression I was beginning to recognize. The expression she got when she was frightened, but was not going to show it. Lyra had climbed the village wall without anyone telling her to. She was standing at the top looking down at the army camp with the expression she got when she was frightened, but had decided not to show it. She shouted down at them, something about the hand of the Sky Father resting on their camp. Sacred ground. Leave or be judged. I had not told her to say that. She had come up with it herself. Lyra, I was beginning to understand, was very good at this. The leader shouted back something that I gathered from tone was not a polite response. I picked up the pen again. I tapped the cable 3 times this time. Tap, tap, tap. 3 invisible fingers from the sky. 3 impacts on an impossibly large white rope. 3 sounds echoing through the camp. 2 soldiers dropped their weapons. The leader yelled at them. I tapped 5 more times. 5 more soldiers dropped their weapons. I had spent the previous night thinking about this problem, and I had come to a conclusion. I did not want to hurt anyone. Not even the soldiers. They were working for someone terrible, but they were also just people trying to survive the same famine everyone else was surviving. I did not want to crush them or flick them, or do anything that Lyra had described from her understanding of what I was capable of. I just wanted them to leave. So I had a plan. I reached for the bag of fish food again. I sprinkled a very generous amount, more than I had given the village, a proper handful, over the army camp. Golden tiles raining down on 60 soldiers. The reaction was immediate and total. 60 people who had been cold and on half rations for 17 days while sitting in a field waiting for 46 starving villagers to give up were suddenly standing in a rain of food. Better food than anything they had eaten in months. Warm-smelling. Golden. Falling from a clear sky. Several of them tried to catch the flakes. Several of them just stood with their mouths open looking up. The leader stood in his tent entrance and watched his army abandon their threatening posture to eat fish food off the ground. He looked up. I was watching him through the glass. He could not see me. The light in my room was positioned in a way that made the glass reflective from inside. But he was looking at the right place. I waited. Then I released the phone charger cable, letting it rise slowly back up through the lid. The impossibly large white rope ascending back into the sky. I left the fish food where it was. The army ate for a long time. Then the leader said something to his officers. Then they packed up camp. Then they left. It took about 40 minutes. Lyra watched from the wall the entire time. When the last soldier had passed out of sight, she turned and looked up at me through the tank glass. Lyra watched from the wall until the last soldier disappeared over the hill. Then she turned and looked up at me. Very quietly she said thank you. How did I know they were hungry, she asked. Everyone is hungry, I told her. It is not complicated. She looked at me for a long time. Then she went back to organizing the distribution of fish food across the village. The food problem was solved for now. But only for now. I sat at my desk with the fish food bag and did some math. The bag held about 200 grams of flakes. I had used maybe 15 grams so far. That left 185 grams. At the rate the village needed food, 46 people, 3 meals a day, a small pinch per meal would last them perhaps 3 weeks if I was careful. 3 weeks was not enough. I needed a permanent food solution. I looked at my kitchen. On the counter, a bag of rice I had bought for the week. A box of oats. A half-used container of table salt. A bottle of cooking oil. 3 eggs I had not used yet. I thought about the egg. Lyra had explained that the village mill, her family's mill, had been grinding grain before the drought. They had the equipment and the knowledge to process grain. What they did not have was grain. I picked up the rice bag. White rice. Cooked it becomes soft and can be eaten directly. Uncooked it can be ground into flour. I reached into the bag and pinched a single grain of rice. 1 grain of rice is about 7 millimeters long. At the scale of Millhaven, scaled up 200 times, 1 grain of rice was approximately 140 centimeters long, about the length of a small tree trunk. I held it over the center of the village square and let it drop. It landed with a small thud that sent Lyra jumping backward 3 steps. She stared at the enormous white cylinder lying in the square. She walked around it slowly. She knocked on it. She looked up at me. What is this? I told her it was grain. Her mill could grind it into flour. Flour becomes bread. She blinked at the enormous white cylinder lying in the square. Then she asked if it was truly grain. A single grain of rice, I said. Yes. She looked at it again. Then she called for her father. Her father came out of the mill, a short, compact man with arms built for heavy work, and examined the grain for a long time. He knocked on it. He sniffed it. He tried to lift it with both hands and failed completely. He called 3 other men over. All 4 of them together could barely roll it. He looked up at me. He said something to Lyra. She looked up and relayed it. Her father wanted to know if it could go into the mill. I looked at the mill. The mill opening was on the side facing me, a small slot where grain would be fed through to be ground. Even at scale, my fingers were too large to place a single grain of rice directly into the mill slot with any precision. I thought about this for a moment. Then I went to my kitchen drawer and found a plastic straw. I inserted the grain of rice into the straw, held the straw over the mill slot, and blew. The grain shot through the straw and into the mill entrance. From their perspective, a grain of rice the size of a tree trunk flew horizontally through the air as if launched by a powerful invisible catapult and embedded itself perfectly in the mill intake. Lyra's father stared at the mill intake. Then he started laughing. He grabbed the mill handle and started grinding. I released 4 more grains of rice down the straw, one by one, into the mill intake. The mill ran for 2 hours. The flour it produced was finer and whiter than anything the village had seen. Modern long-grain rice ground in a medieval stone mill produces a flour of extraordinary quality. Within the village's context, it was a miracle. Within my context, it was the contents of my weekly rice bag, released 1 grain at a time. By evening, Lyra's mother had baked 12 small loaves of bread. The whole village ate. I ordered a second bag of rice on delivery that night and did not tell anyone where it came from. 3 days later, I had a new problem. The army was gone, but Lord Aldrich was not. Lyra explained that Lord Aldrich was not personally camped outside the village. He was in his estate about 6 miles away, which in tank terms was somewhere outside the glass entirely. The soldiers had been his representatives. When they returned without the taxes, he would send more. He owned everything. The land, the mill, the road, technically the village itself. I thought about this for a long time. Then I went online. I spent 2 hours reading about medieval land law, feudal systems, property rights, and the specific mechanisms by which a lord's claim over a piece of land could be challenged or overridden. There was one consistent answer: documents. In medieval systems, written documentation, properly sealed and witnessed, carried enormous legal weight. A lord's claim was ultimately backed by a document. Challenge the document, or produce a counter-document with better authority, and the claim could be disputed. I looked at my desk. I had a pen, a sheet of printer paper, and a roll of tape. I thought about what Lord Aldrich's soldiers would do if they came back and found the village protected not by mysterious sky events, which they could report and explain away, but by a physical document claiming the land had been placed under the protection of a higher authority than Lord Aldrich. The highest authority in their world was the church. I opened a Word document on my laptop. I spent 40 minutes composing, in the most formal, archaic-sounding language I could manage, a declaration of sacred sanctuary, claiming Millhaven and its lands as property under the direct protection of the divine authority of the Sky Father, sealed with the authority of the heavenly realm, witnessed and recorded in the eternal records. I printed it. The paper was approximately A4 size. To the villagers, when I lowered it into the tank, it was a document the size of a large building wall. Pure white paper with perfect black text in a font they had never seen. I lowered it slowly into the village square. It settled flat on the ground. Every person in the village came to look at it. The letters were too large to read standing next to the document. They had to climb on top of it and walk across the surface, reading it one letter at a time, which they did carefully, taking turns. Lyra read the whole thing 3 times. Then she looked up. The Sky Father in the document. Was that me? The document says what it says, I told her. She held my gaze for a long moment, then let it go. A practical person in an impractical situation. Where to put it was obvious. Facing outward on the village wall, the first thing anyone would see before they saw anything else. Especially anyone arriving to collect taxes. She directed 3 men to carry the document, which required 6 people to roll it around a pole made from a fence post, and mount it on the village wall facing outward where anyone approaching would see it first. It took half the afternoon to mount. When they were done, the village wall had a paper document the size of a building facade attached to it, in perfect printed text, declaring divine ownership of the land. Lord Aldrich's soldiers came back 8 days later. They took one look at the wall. They went back. They did not come again for a long time. I want to tell you about the water situation, because it is both the most important thing I did and the thing I am least proud of how it happened. Millhaven was in drought. The village well was running low. The tiny stream that ran past the mill, which I had admired as a decorative feature when I first bought the tank, was barely a trickle. I had been thinking about this problem since the first day. The solution was obvious: water. Add water to the tank. But adding water the way you add water to a fish tank, pouring it from a glass, would create a flood that would destroy everything. The water had to come in slowly, gently, like rain. I had a small spray bottle under the sink that I used for plants. I did not currently have any plants, but I had bought the spray bottle with good intentions. I filled it with clean water and held it over the tank with the nozzle set to the finest mist setting. I pressed the trigger once. From above the tank, a cloud of fine mist drifted down. From inside the tank, it was rain. Actual rain. Coming from a clear sky, appearing from nowhere, fine and even and cool, settling on the dry ground and running in tiny rivulets toward the stream. The reaction in the village was immediate. People ran outside. The old woman who had looked at me in the square and pressed her hands to her chest came out of her house and stood in the mist with her arms out and her face up. Children ran into the square and opened their mouths. Lyra stood at the edge of the stream and watched the water level rise. Her father came out of the mill and stood next to her. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned against him. I pressed the spray bottle trigger again. And again. I sat there for 20 minutes gently misting the tank, watching the stream fill, watching the well begin to rise, watching the dry ground darken. I went through most of a bottle of tap water. To the village, it rained for half a day. After the rain stopped, Lyra's father went to the mill and started it grinding again. The stream was running properly now, the water wheel was turning for the first time in months. I could hear it, very faintly, through the open lid. A tiny water wheel turning in a tiny mill in a fish tank in my apartment. I sat and listened to it for a while. Then I went and refilled the spray bottle. I want to skip ahead slightly because I could spend the entire rest of this story on the individual moments. And there were many, but I want to get to the part where things got genuinely complicated. By the end of the first week, I had established the following. Millhaven had food. I was providing rice grains every day, supplemented by occasional other things. A few flakes of oats, which ground into a porridge that the village found extraordinary, and once, memorably, half a vitamin C tablet that I dropped in by accident, and which produced a white disc the size of a house that tasted like oranges, and was apparently the most unusual thing anyone in the village had ever eaten. Millhaven had water. Daily misting had become a morning routine. I set a reminder on my phone. Millhaven had security. The declaration document on the wall had held so far. But Millhaven had a new problem. Other people had heard about it. Lyra explained it to me on day 9. 3 people had arrived at the village gate that morning. Refugees from another village 2 valleys over, which in tank terms was somewhere just outside my field of vision through the glass, past the sculpted hills at the left edge of the tank. They were starving. They had heard that Millhaven had food. They were asking to come in. I looked at the 3 tiny figures at the gate. They were thinner than the Millhaven villagers had been when I arrived. They were holding each other up. Let them in, I told her. I had a very large bag of rice and absolutely no intention of letting anyone go hungry while it was sitting on my desk. She looked at me for a moment, then opened the gate. She let them in. By the end of that day, there were 9 refugees. By the end of the week, there were 40 more. By the end of the second week, Millhaven had a population of 112 people, and I was going through rice at a rate that was becoming noticeable on my grocery bill. I did the math. 112 people. 3 meals a day. Growing every day as word spread. I needed a better food system. I needed them to be able to grow their own food. The tank had soil. Real soil. Whoever had built this setup had used actual earth rather than sand or filler. The drought had baked it hard, but it was there. What I needed was seeds. And water. And fertilizer, probably. I went to the campus plant biology lab on a Wednesday afternoon and had a very educational conversation with a professor about soil remediation, drought recovery, and optimal conditions for growing grain in compacted earth. I did not explain why I was asking. I came home with a small sample of a slow-release fertilizer compound and a bag of heritage wheat seeds the professor had given me for reasons I am still not entirely clear on. I looked at the wheat seeds. They were very small, about 4 millimeters each. At scale, inside the tank, each seed would be about 80 centimeters long. Manageable. Plant-able. I held one over the field area outside the village walls and dropped it. It hit the earth with a thud that sent Lyra's father running out of the mill. He stared at the seed. He picked it up. He smelled it. He dropped it and ran back inside. He came back out carrying a metal spike that he normally used for something mill-related. He drove the spike into the ground next to the seed, then used it as a lever to dig a small furrow. He pushed the seed in. He looked up at me. I said, "Good. Do that for all of them." I dropped 17 more seeds, one by one, over different parts of the field. Then I filled the spray bottle and misted the field specifically and carefully, concentrating the water on the planted area. Then I took the tiniest amount of fertilizer compound I could measure, smaller than a grain of sand as far as I was concerned, dissolved it in a capful of water, and dripped 3 drops onto the field. To the village, a miracle liquid from heaven, falling in 3 perfect drops onto the newly planted field. I sat back and looked at the tiny field. 17 seeds. In good soil. With water. With fertilizer. In the real world, wheat takes about 4 months to grow. I did not know if the same timeline applied in the tank. I went to bed. I woke up the next morning, and the wheat was 6 inches tall. I want to stop here and address something because you are probably thinking it. Yes, time works differently in the tank. I figured this out over the following days. One day outside the tank appeared to be approximately 1 week inside the tank. Maybe slightly more. The wheat that I had planted grew to harvest height in about 10 days of my time, which translated to roughly 10 weeks of their time. This meant everything I thought I understood about the timeline was wrong. The drought they had been experiencing was not a 2-year drought from my perspective. It was a 2-year drought from their perspective, which was approximately 2 months from mine. The army outside the walls had been there for 17 days from their perspective, which was about 2.5 days from mine, the afternoon and evening before I opened the lid for the first time. It also meant that every hour I spent away from the tank, sleeping, going to class, sitting in lectures, was approximately a week of their time passing without me watching. I thought about all the things that could happen in a week. I bought a small camera and set it up angled at the tank, connected to my laptop, recording continuously. I checked the footage when I got back from class. In the 6 hours I had been at the university, Lord Aldrich had apparently sent a formal written response to the Declaration of Sacred Sanctuary. A messenger had arrived at the village gate carrying a scroll. Lyra had received it, read it, and gathered the village elders to discuss it. I fast-forwarded through the discussion. It took about 20 minutes of footage, which translated to roughly 2.5 days of their time. And at the end of it Lyra came and stood in the center of the square and looked up at the camera. She could see the camera lens. She had noticed it 3 days ago and had worked out, with impressive speed, that it was how I watched when I was not at the desk. She said to the camera, "Lord Aldrich says the divine protection document has no authority in his land. He is sending soldiers again. He says there will be more this time." I watched this footage sitting in my apartment eating a granola bar. I said, "How many more?" She said, "The messenger said 200. I looked at the tank. 200 soldiers. I looked at my desk. My phone charger cable had worked on 60. It might not work on 200. They would have had time to think about it, to realize that the rope from the sky, while alarming, had not actually hurt anyone. I needed something different. I needed something that was loud. I looked around my room. I looked at my phone. I opened my music app and found the loudest, most dramatic piece of orchestral music I could find. I chose the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which starts with 4 of the most recognizable and aggressive notes in classical music history. I turned the volume to maximum. I held the phone speaker directly against the glass lid. Press play. Dun 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 doyuin. The entire tank vibrated. Through the camera, I could see every person in the village freeze simultaneously like they had been hit by a bolt of lightning. Lyra grabbed the well for support. Outside the village, a group of sparrows that had been sitting in the miniature trees on the hillside all launched into the air at once. I played it 3 more times. Then I opened the lid and said, very clearly, "Tell Lord Aldrich that the Skyfather has spoken." Lyra, still gripping the well, looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts terrified and deeply impressed. She said, "Was that the voice of heaven?" I said, "That was Beethoven." But yes. She did not know what Beethoven was. She relayed the message to the elders. The elders relayed it to the messenger. The messenger left. Lord Aldrich's 200 soldiers did not come that week. But he sent them eventually. I am going to tell you about the day the soldiers came because it is the day everything changed, and also the day I finally understood what the fish tank actually was, and where it came from, and why the old woman at the garage sale had sold it to me for $5. It was a Thursday. I had a morning lecture, and I got back to my apartment at about noon. I checked the camera footage immediately. The soldiers had arrived at dawn. Their dawn, which was about 3 hours after I had left for class. 230 of them this time. Proper soldiers, not the rough collection of men the first group had been. These wore matching surcoats. They had a cavalry unit of 20 horses. They had not stopped outside the wall. They had broken the gate. My chest went cold watching the footage. I fast-forwarded. The village had not been attacked. The soldiers had pushed through the gate and were now occupying the square. The villagers were all gathered at the far end of the village, near the mill. The soldiers were conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of the buildings, looking for the food stores. Lyra was standing in front of the mill door with her arms out, facing the soldier's officer. He was speaking to her. She was shaking her head. I pressed play at normal speed. The officer reached out and grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her away from the mill door. I stood up. I pulled my desk chair to the side. I looked at my desk with the focused attention of someone who has 4 seconds to solve a problem. My hand fell on the spray bottle. I picked it up. I filled it at the sink in about 15 seconds. I came back to the tank. I held the spray bottle over the soldiers, specifically over the officers and the cavalry, who were clustered in the square. I set the spray bottle to its highest flow setting, not mist but actual stream. I pressed the trigger. A jet of water shot down into the tank. From above, a controlled stream. From inside, a column of water the width of a building, falling vertically from a clear sky, hitting the square with the force and volume of a waterfall. The officer holding Lyra's arm let go. He and the 6 men around him were soaked to the bone in approximately 1 second. The horses reared. 2 cavalry riders fell off. I redirected the stream to the other side of the square. Another group of soldiers hit by an impossible pillar of water from nowhere. I moved it again. And again. Within 40 seconds, I had soaked about 60 soldiers and terrified approximately 200 horses. The cavalry broke first. Horses that have been terrified by invisible water attacks make their own decisions regardless of the rider's preferences. They ran for the gate. Several took their riders with them. The infantry lasted about 90 more seconds. Then they ran. All 230 of them. Through the broken gate, down the path, over the sculpted hills, and out of the range of my tank's view. I stood there with the spray bottle, breathing hard, looking at the empty square. Lyra was still standing in front of the mill door, soaking wet, watching the last of the dust cloud disappear over the hill. She looked at the broken gate, at the empty square, at the spray bottle still in my hand. She already knew the rain had been me. We both already knew Lord Aldrich would not stop, that eventually he would stop sending soldiers and come himself. She looked up at the camera with that question on her face. What then? I looked at the spray bottle, at the fish food bag, at the declaration on the wall, still dripping, then at my laptop. And I had an idea. What happened next took me 3 days to set up. I want to walk you through it because it is the most important thing I did, and it is also the most ridiculous thing I have ever done in my life. And I am including the time in year 9 when I tried to teach myself skateboarding by watching videos and broke my wrist. Lord Aldrich, I had established through Lyra's information, was a legitimate noble with legitimate legal claims over the land. He had documents. He had seals. He had the backing of the regional hierarchy. The Declaration of Sacred Sanctuary I had printed was effective as a deterrent because soldiers did not want to violate something divine. But Lord Aldrich himself, an educated noble who understood the limits of the church's actual jurisdiction, would not be stopped by a printed document from an inkjet printer. What he would be stopped by was a better legal claim. And for that, I needed to go above him. The highest legal authority in their world was the king. I spent 3 days researching medieval English royal charters. The actual documents, the actual language, the actual seals. I found an academic website maintained by a university archive that had scanned images of actual 13th century royal charters, complete with Latin text, official formatting, and the royal seal design. I reproduced one. I spent 8 hours on it. I used everything. The correct Latin phrases, the correct dating format, the correct witness list structure. I printed it on the heaviest paper I owned. I found an image of the royal seal online and printed it separately, cut it out, and attached it with a small blob of red candle wax that I melted from a birthday candle. I held the finished document up and looked at it. It claimed, in the name of the King of England, that the village of Millhaven and its surrounding lands were hereby designated as a royal protected settlement, exempt from all local noble taxation, under direct crown stewardship, effective immediately and in perpetuity. It looked, I am going to be honest with you, extremely convincing. I lowered it into the tank. Lyra read every word 3 times. Then she looked up with the question she already knew I would not answer directly. Did the king truly send this? The document says what it says, I told her. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then very quietly she said I was a very interesting god. I told her I was a university student. She considered this for a second and said she did not think those 2 things were mutually exclusive. I had absolutely no response to that. I mounted the royal charter on the wall next to the Declaration of Sacred Sanctuary. Lord Aldrich came in person 4 days later. He rode a white horse. He had 50 knights with him. He was wearing the medieval equivalent of his best outfit. He stopped in front of the village wall. He looked at the 2 documents. He looked at the village. He looked at the 2 documents again. He sat on his horse for a very long time. Then he rode away. His 50 knights rode after him. He did not come back. I want to jump forward again because the thing that happened next is what I need to tell you about, and it is not about Lord Aldrich. About a month after Lord Aldrich's last visit, which was 2.5 to 3 weeks in my time, Lyra came to stand in the center of the square and looked up at the camera with a different expression than I had seen before. Not frightened. Not grateful. Not determined. Sad. I was at my desk. I leaned forward. I said, "What happened?" She said, "Old Margaret died." I knew who she meant. The old white-haired woman who had stood in the first rain and held out her arms. The one who had pressed her hands to her chest in the square after the first fish food fell. She had been, Lyra had told me, 71 years old. She had been the oldest person in the village. She had survived 2 droughts and 1 war, and the death of her husband and 4 of her 7 children, and she had seen food fall from the sky and rain fall in drought and soldiers run from water, and she had gone to sleep 4 days ago and not woken up. I sat at my desk. I did not say anything for a while. Lyra said Margaret had left a message for me. Before the end, she had asked Lyra to pass it on. Tell the one above that I was not afraid. Not at the end, because I had seen that the world was looked after. That was enough. I sat at my desk in my small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Clement Street. I had not cried about anything in approximately 3 years. I was not going to cry now. I was just going to sit very still for a moment. I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, tell them. Whatever you need. I will be here. Lyra pressed her hands to her chest the same way Margaret had. She said, we know. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I will tell you about the old woman at the garage sale because I went back and found her, and I now know where the tank came from and what it is, and it is not what I expected. The one more thing is this. The village grew. Over the following weeks, their following months, their following seasons, Millhaven grew. The wheat fields produced. The mill ran. The refugee population stabilized and became permanent residents. New buildings went up. I helped by providing Lego bricks for foundations in 2 cases where the ground was too hard to dig. They looked from the outside like ancient stone with very precise rectangular edges, which the villagers accepted as a miracle of divine construction. The population reached 200, then 250, then 300. There was a small school. Lyra had organized it. She had learned to read English from our conversations and had been teaching the children, writing out an alphabet on paper, which to them was printed letters the size of furniture. There was a proper market. The documents I had provided had apparently made the rounds. In their world, the news that Millhaven was under royal and divine protection had spread to other villages, and traders were coming, which meant commerce, which meant Millhaven was becoming something more than a starving village. There was a doctor, of sorts, a woman named Petra who had arrived as a refugee and had some medical knowledge, and to whom I had provided, very carefully, 1/2 of 1 aspirin tablet, dissolved in water, which in their terms was enough pain relief medication to treat the entire village for approximately 3 years. Lyra was 21 now. She had a deputy, a young man named Cole who had arrived as a refugee and turned out to be extremely good at organizing things. They ran the village together with the efficiency of people who had learned very fast that the world could change completely without warning, and that preparation was the only reasonable response to that knowledge. She came to the square most evenings and reported to the camera. I watched from wherever I was, my desk, my bed, the corner of my room where I sometimes sat with my laptop. It was the most reliable conversation in my life. I went back to the garage sale woman. Her name was Mrs. Abelard. She was 73 years old. She lived 3 streets away from the garage sale address in a house that was full of things in the specific way of a person who has collected their whole life. I knocked on her door on a Sunday afternoon. She opened the door and looked at me for a moment. Then she stepped aside to let me in. Her husband had built the tank 40 years ago around something he had found in an antique market in Prague. A physicist by training, he had spent years trying to understand what the tank actually was. Not a container, he eventually concluded. A window. A fold in the world where the inside was smaller than the outside. A place that already existed, somewhere the world wrapped back on itself, and the glass was simply the border between their scale and ours. He had filled 3 notebooks with observations and theories. She gave them to me at the kitchen table along with a spray bottle he had modified specifically for the tank, better calibrated nozzle, a measurement gauge on the side. She had sold the tank for $5 because she was 73 and her hands shook too much to hold the spray bottle steady anymore. Her eyes could no longer make out the details through the glass. She had needed someone who would take it seriously, and she had been watching the garage sale all morning, and I was the only person who had looked at it the way she used to look at it. She asked about the village. About Margaret. Margaret had died, I told her. About 2 weeks ago in their time. She nodded slowly. She said Margaret had been old already when they first found the tank. Over 30 years ago. Before I left, she asked me one thing. Would I take care of them? For a long time. Yes, I told her. As long as they need. She gave me a second spray bottle that her husband had modified specifically for the tank. The nozzle was better calibrated for fine mist, and there was a small measurement gauge on the side. She gave me his notes, 40 years of observations, written in small, precise handwriting, about the tank and the village and the people in it. I walked home carrying the notes and the spray bottle. I sat down at my desk. I opened the lid slightly. When I got back, Lyra was in the square. She looked up at the camera the way she always did when she had been waiting. I had been gone a long time, she said. Something had happened. I told her what I had found out. Where the tank came from. The physicist and his notebooks. The window theory. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if it was strange, knowing they were inside a glass box. I thought about what Mrs. Abelard's husband had written in his notes. That the whole world might be a glass box for something bigger. That every time he looked into the tank, he was reminded that everything we see could be the same, just at a different scale. So probably we are all in the same situation, I told her. Just at different sizes. She thought about this for a long time. It is either very comforting or very unsettling, she said finally. Both, I said. I have not decided which yet. She almost smiled. The wheat harvest was in 3 days. She did not need to ask. I was not going anywhere. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the tank on my desk, next to my wobbly lamp, in my small apartment that smelled of instant noodles on the 3rd floor of a building on Clement Street. 300 people. A functioning mill. Fields of growing wheat. A school. A market. A doctor. Buildings with Lego foundations. A royal charter on the village wall. All of it. Because I went to a garage sale looking for a lamp and came home with a fish tank. I reached for the spray bottle. Set it to fine mist. Held it over the tank. Let it rain. And that is the complete story of Millhaven. The kingdom in my fish tank. The village that taught me that the distance between a god and a university student is mostly a matter of perspective, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do for anyone, at any scale, is simply be there when they look up. If you made it to the end of this, one, you have been with me for the whole journey, and I am genuinely grateful for that. This one meant a lot to me to tell. Now the vote for the next video. First choice. The terrarium my grandfather left me. Inside it a civilization that has been waiting 300 years for their god to return. I am not their god. I am 22 years old, and I have no idea what I am doing. They think I am exactly who they have been waiting for. Second choice. The snow globe I bought for $2 at a flea market. Inside it a village buried in permanent winter. They have been cold for longer than anyone can remember. I have a candle and a piece of cotton wool and a hand warmer packet. Let us see what we can do. Drop your vote in the comments right now. Top vote is next. And if you are new here, subscribe. Because I refuse to make anything that is not worth your time. See you in the next one.